Greetings, friends. You're on NewsAder. I'm Alexander Kushner. Vitaly Portnikov from Kiev is in touch with us. Greetings, Vitaly. Hello? Vitaly, we have all seen and heard at least a partial speech by Vladimir Putin. And we saw some very interesting things there, that Putin is actually very seriously out of touch with reality. When he says that he is allegedly controlled entirely by Russian troops and that strikes on the Russian tanker fleet will not actually harm oil exports. And that 1% of the growth of the Russian economy is not a technical recession, but it is actually a positive signal. So what do we understand about Putin? That he, it turns out, lives completely in an inverted world, doesn't it? Or maybe it's some kind of tricky game. Well, then what is it really designed for? Well, I think that it is designed primarily to demonstrate propaganda capabilities. Because Putin says that everything is good for him at the front, everything is bad for Ukraine. Ukraine should capitulate as soon as possible. Americans needs to Ukraine to pressure, to as fast as possible, to the Ukrainians have fulfilled all the conditions. Which is today Russia, and her privileged position at the front, so it can make demands. Therefore, I just don't see anything in all these statements about Kupinsk, about other settlements of Ukraine. That would demonstrate a certain isolation of Putin from reality. He does not need to provide real information. He needs to demonstrate his strength and ability to dictate conditions to Ukraine, with the help of pressure, including from the United States. And, that is, he lies in order to, well, as if to fill with words the space that he cannot really fill with strength. Of course, and this generally affects everything, after the collapse of the Blitzkrieg, he was going to seize the whole of Ukraine. Has he given up on this task? No, and he won't refuse. But since Russian troops cannot advance through Ukrainian territory in such a way as to carry out this intention, to the paradigm that was planned in February of the 22nd year, completely different possibilities can be used. A war of attrition, the transformation of Ukraine into a territory that is not adapted for the further residence of the population. Creating conditions in order to destabilize the situation in a neighboring country. To demonstrate to the population of a neighboring country that the troops of this neighboring country cannot defend the territory anyway. And those who are able to replenish the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine are fewer and fewer. So think for yourself. You will die at the front anyway. So it may be better to surrender than to die tomorrow. A simple propaganda tactic that can quite act on many, but at the same time, it is a tactic for the West. It is a tactic for Americans. If you don't force them to capitulate today, you will still lose. Ukraine will still be ours, but you will look like weaklings. Therefore, it is better for you to let them lose today, on some conditions that you can pass off as your own peacefulness. This is a signal to the Europeans. First of all, you don't have enough money to support Ukraine, which will be defeated without that. It's unclear how many billions of dollars you are going to spend. It can be said to be sent to the oven to help Ukraine fight the war, which it will lose anyway. And most importantly, it will soon destabilize your own countries. Therefore, this is such a simple elementary Chekist intimidation tactic. You know that the security officers, they act differently. They persuade you from time to time with such, I would say, a satisfied look, and look for common ground with you. And very often they behave completely differently. Well, at the same time as Putin spoke, literally yes, I imagine this picture of him smiling smugly. And tankers burning behind him. Yesterday a tanker burned down, yesterday another warship burned down in the Caspian Sea, more oil platforms burned down. Some kind of horror just happens, right? Well, these are facts that cannot be disputed. Well, Putin pretends that this does not exist, although the whole internet sees it. Of course, he didn't just pretend it doesn't exist, it says that it does not affect the supply of petroleum products. Yes, he does not deny the facts that something is happening with tankers. It's just that for him, what is happening is an additional trump card in justifying the need to liquidate the Ukrainian state. Because it is a terrorist regime that undermines Russian tanks. This is exactly what he always lacks in contacts with the Russian population. That you thought I was having fun when I was trying to destroy the Ukrainian state. And this is a state that, if it exists, will threaten Russia with Russia. Therefore, the only way for us to live peacefully and happily, is to destroy Ukraine. Finally understand this. From Putin's point of view, each undermined tanker is a kind of plus in his ideology. And you see, it is possible to justify the situation historically, economically, like Putin. There is no Ukraine, and the regime that is there, an artificial regime, is simply engaged in terror, undermining tankers in peaceful seas. It is possible, like Latynina, to say that as long as the current Ukraine exists, it represents a historical challenge to Russia, because it denies the ties that Ukraine has always had with Russia. In other words, there is a certain absolute consensus in Russian society, wide, from Latynina to Putin, which says that we need to endure everything, but Ukraine needs to be destroyed in the coming years. As long as Ukraine exists, Russia cannot breathe calmly. By the way, I have never denied this consensus. I've always said the same thing. As long as Russia exists, it will try to destroy Ukraine. Ukrainians have no chance. There is no other way to think. Ukrainians will either fight off Russia and create conditions under which Russia will not have the opportunity to destroy Ukraine, or the Ukrainian state will disappear from the political map of the world, and the Ukrainian people from the ethnographic one. There will be no other ending to this war. Either Russia does not have enough forces to destroy Ukraine, or it will be destroyed. There will be no buffer state, no middle ground, no compromise anymore. This is the last time. Because the Russian chauvinists have already tried several times in a row to create some kind of compromise with the Ukrainian people, well, perhaps because of the large enough number of opportunities for their own illusions. Hoping that Ukrainians will agree with this, I would say, the existence of a second nation in their empire. Yes, not the first, but not the fifth. So it was after Pereyaslav, so it was after October 1917th year. Each time, a kind of decoration was created for Ukrainians, which they had to feel good and dance hopuk. And every time there was an imperial crisis, Ukrainians refused this role of a subordinate second nation. This was the case in 1917-1918, when Ukrainians voted for the Ukrainian People's Republic, and were ready to fight for it with arms in their hands with two Russian armies, white and red. So it was in August of 1991 year, when the conflict between the two Russian centers of power helped the Ukrainians to proclaim a sovereign state and refused to make this sovereign state part of a kind of renewed union, which led to the fact that the project of the renewed union collapsed before our eyes. There will not be a third case of coexistence. Because all those who rules Russia today is again a chauvinistic regime, it is clear that even if we imagine a kind of loyal Ukraine today, as soon as a new crisis occurs in Russia, and any state can be in the role of a victim in a situation of a new crisis of economic and political problems, no one is immune from this. Ukrainians will immediately cancel this loyalty and again want to join NATO, the European Union, and again do not want to be with Russia, and again do not want to have a foreign language taught in their schools and to teach foreign writers. For the third time, everything will happen exactly the same. Therefore, the Ukrainian people should be erased from the ethnographic map of Europe. And this war is really for this kind of goals, not even for Ukrainian statehood as such. Because, you see, Ukrainian statehood, as we have already seen, unlike, for example, Belarusian, implies that the pressure of those who want Ukrainians to be Ukrainians and not Russians is increasing. Therefore, by the way, Alexander, in the Ukrainian society, too, there is some separation. Because there are a huge number of people who do not feel the Ukrainians' identity, but appreciate the statehood of Ukraine. In principle, from a cultural and civilizational point of view, these people are closer to Russians. But they don't want to be part of Russia. And there are people who perceive themselves as Ukrainians and understand that the Ukrainian state is the protection of their Ukrainian identity as such. And these two parts of the Ukrainian population, in principle antagonistic from the point of view of the idea of the future of Ukraine, are now fighting together. But for Russia, an important task would be to separate them. Only they deny statehood to some and identity to others, which is why they do not find supporters here. So far, the pro-Russian part of the population, which has always accounted for almost half of the population of Ukraine, they did not deny statehood, they could count on its support. When the annexation of territories with a predominantly pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian population in terms of identity began, they lost support for this part as well. Reformulating Volodin, there is Ukraine, there is no Russia. There is no Ukraine, there is Russia. There is a Russian imperial project. You call in your clip that Putin has done his aggressive bluff. So the key here is still bluff or aggression. What do you think? I think this is both bluff and aggression. Somewhere there is aggression, which ends with concrete some action. There's a bluff, because again, for all that, we understand that Putin cannot capture the entire territory of Ukraine. And the question arises when we say, yes, he can exhaust Ukraine, do it over the next few years. But what will happen to Russia itself? This is also an important point. Will Russia break down in this struggle? Moreover, there was an unpleasant surprise on the day of Putin's press conference. The European Union has finally agreed that it will allocate 90 billion euros to help Ukraine in 2026. In 2027 years. Yes, maybe it's not all the money that is needed. Well, it is clear that the remaining 135, there are 40 billion euros. They can be found in other sources, after all. They have already been found, and I can remind you that under Biden, they will give 50 billion on account of interest from Russian assets. Therefore, in principle, everything is closed. Under Biden? Yes, as far as I remember, Biden, together with the G7 countries as a whole, gathered and decided that they were allocating, as it were, out of their own pocket, relatively speaking, $50 billion of all the interest that would be accrued on Russia. And I got it? In the next 10 years. Yes, that is, this $140 billion of the Ukrainian budget deficit is being closed for 2 years. Well, as far as I understand. But 90 billion. In general, I think that in many ways this so-called peace plan, proposed by Kirill Dmitriev to Steve Witkoff, was connected with preventing the allocation of this money. Why allocate money if the world is tomorrow anyway? And note that Donald Trump played an important role in blocking this money. He acted in concert with Putin. And it was not just the Americans themselves who insisted that Russian assets should not be allocated to help Ukraine. But their allies in Europe also blocked it. Do you understand? Here's George Meloni, you've seen how she's been behaving in recent weeks. It actually blocked the transfer of Russian assets. Let's not be naive here, let's not think that Belgian Prime Minister Bert de Wever did this. No, he just behaved completely differently. He refused to transfer the Russian money, but immediately said that the summit of the European Union could not end without the allocation of money. He had this thesis: we cannot help Ukraine. Let them fork out their money, right? They give Russian, and she puts a difficult situation. And there was no confidence that it would be possible to allocate these 90 billion euros by unanimous vote until the last moment. You can see that some levers of influence were found on Orban, Fitz, and Babiš. And the most important thing is that the Federal Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, did not really want to allocate his own money for this assistance. He wanted to get along with the Russians. In other words, it was a difficult situation, they counted on it, but miscalculated. By the way, now I wonder how the peace talks will go. Is this, one might say, a victory for Europe, or is it a fly in the ointment, given that Russian assets were not touched? I don't see any fly in the ointment, to be honest. Because Russian assets, and so indefinitely frozen. The Europeans are already giving this money to Ukraine, saying that you should give us this money when Russia starts paying you reparations. In other words, at the next stage of the development of the situation, the Europeans can already say sorry to Russia itself. We gave Ukraine money, hoping that we will return it from the reparations that you will pay for your aggression. And you don't want to pay reparations, okay, then we will take your assets as reparations, or pay money to Ukraine. There may also be a variety of negotiation processes around these assets over the coming years. It is no accident that George Meloni said that we should not confiscate this money without a proper legal basis. No one prevents the Europeans from creating their proper legal framework over the next few years, and then pinning down Russia's account. I also understood that from what was said, yes, we are now allocating 90 billion as if from our own. But even then not from our own. This loan will be on the investment markets. And then in the future, we will still take these 90 billion of Russian assets that we are entitled to. We just need to prepare this very legal basis for our discussions. Because it's still a reparative loan. It is still assumed that this money will be given from Russian reparations. But how these reparations will be carried out, through Russia's goodwill or unkind, is a completely different question. Vitaly, it seems to me that these 90 billion, in addition to many other billions that Europe allocates to Ukraine, is also a counterstrike against Trump. He keeps saying Europe doesn't help much, although it's not true. Even the previous figures show that it helps us more than the United States. But now he will definitely have nothing to cover. Europe gives its 90 billion, Trump does not give anything. He is profiting from the war like some dirty huckster. But that's his strategy. He talks all the time about making money, not spending it, and he's proud of it. It's not like you're telling Trump something that he wants to give up. No, we don't give a penny to Ukraine, on the contrary, they pay money for weapons there. Great. This war does not affect us in any way, it is on another continent. We are trying to prevent it so that there will be no more killing of people. But since we have not been able to do this yet, we earn everything very well. America, first of all, what do you want to show Trump here? When he was elected by American voters with exactly such slogans, so that he would profit from other people's troubles, so that he would rob the world around him. People who voted for Trump have exactly the same attitude to reality as he does. I remember very well how one of Trump's supporters, even before the election, when it was not known who would be president, told me, "What's wrong, Kevin? Why don't you like Trump?" Well, Ukraine will remain on the right bank of the Dnieper, and there will be fruitful economic cooperation on the left bank. And this man is completely satisfied. Although this is a man, so to speak, with $1 million fortune, let's say, a major American businessman. Well, not big with such conditions, not big, but nevertheless. I remember it very well, it's a dialogue. I hope this dialogue was not public, because it's probably a shame to say this in front of an audience. Why is it a shame if they say it out loud everywhere? This dialogue was not public, but I have seen a huge number of such public dialogues, not with myself. That is, they are not shy already. Don't be shy. Because these are people without value, without morality, these are people for whom profit and earnings are the only possible goal in their political activities. This is a substitution of politics by business. And by the way, this also affects the negotiations, as you can see that the negotiations are essentially conducted by businessmen. Vitka Fikushna and Dmitriev. The offices of the United States Department of State, the National Security Council of the United States, the intelligence community of the United States, are suspended from participating in the negotiations. Vitkov defiantly refuses to contact the intelligence community of the United States. He doesn't want to know the truth about Russia. He does not want to talk about his dialogue with Putin, because he fears that this will prevent him from earning money. That's it. You pointed out that Trump was clearly trying to make sure that these Russian assets were not allocated. Does this mean that, in principle, it corresponds to his strategy of de-energizing the Ukrainian army, when he blocked the allocation of military packages? In other words, this is a direct, in fact, game against Ukraine. That is, to deprive her of money, to deprive her of weapons. Well, I don't think that's what he was thinking, by the way. But he could believe that if the Europeans allocate frozen Russian assets in Ukraine, it will definitely put an end to the peace talks. And this, by the way, is what Putin Witkov could simply say, that if you assume, Steve, that the Europeans will take our money, you cannot even come here anymore. It may be a direct blackmail to which they succumbed. They could not prevent the allocation of these 90 billion euros to Ukraine, and did not say a word at all about not having to allocate money. They were only interested in assets, because they believed that these assets could block the so-called peace process. Just as they continue to believe that the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territory of Donetsk region will end the war. They live in their own world. We must remember this. An intelligence community that doesn't listen to excesses. Here again, Reuters, with reference to this self-intelligence community, says that American intelligence officers, while Trump talks about friendship with Russia, say that Russia's revanchist goals extend far beyond Ukraine. That Putin wants to seize the Baltic states, that he plans attacks on NATO countries. How can this be explained at all? After all, I remind you that, for example, the head of the intelligence community is in general Tulsi Gabbard, right? Quite a clear and consistent supporter of Donald Trump. How does that happen? So she doesn't write these texts, she reads them. You understand that Tulsi Gabbard understands the situation approximately like Donald Trump. But they simply cannot not post objective reports. But you see again, when we say that Putin wants influence in the countries of Central Europe, or wants to seize the Baltic states there, you don't need to be an intelligence officer for this. And in our dialogues with you, I constantly tell you that we are talking about Russia's withdrawal at the border of 1991st year of the Soviet Union. However, I have said this repeatedly without any American intelligence officers, because I know this. Because such plans began to be developed at the beginning of the 2000th years, immediately after Putin came to power. In various, I would say, political science centers that were created under United Russia. There were several clubs in one of them. A similar direction was led by the future advisor of Surkov, Rappaport, who would later become the curator of the occupied territories. It was already being developed there at that time. And it wasn't any special secret. They discussed all this as consolidation of the post-Soviet space. Yes, perhaps there were no direct, so to speak, any statements about the occupation of the annexation. But there was a clear term for reintegration. And this applied to all former Soviet republics. Strom, as for the Baltic states, it's always for me been a question. Because I wonder how Putin and his entourage are ready to cross the borders of NATO, and most importantly questioned the legal decision of the Soviet Union. Because from their point of view, all the former Soviet republics left the Soviet Union illegitimately. But the Baltic states were recognized by an independent decision of the USSR State Council itself. So as much as they can for some time to pull the plug. And, by the way, that is why the entry of the Baltic states into NATO did not cause such hysteria in Moscow, but as one might assume. It was even already under Putin, if you remember. Because it was such a cut a slice. And there is one more point that always guides them when they think about the Baltic states. This is about the same as on Western Ukraine. Many in the Russian leadership consider the annexation of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia and Western Ukraine, without stripping the territory, as a serious geopolitical mistake of Stalin, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the way, I am doing this too, so that it is not my unfounded statements. I recently read this in the memoirs of the recently deceased former First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union Anatoly Damyshin. Here he is writing in black and white, although he was a man who respected international law, that Stalin's greed and his penchant for megalomania led to the fact that when Russell, in 1945, offered him to give up Western Ukraine and give it back to Poland, he refused it. And as a result, this led to the consequences that in 1991 affected the collapse of the Soviet Union. In other words, they continued to believe that it was the presence of Western regions as part of Soviet Ukraine that created the substrate that helped Ukraine to free itself from Russian occupation. But the same thing is Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. By and large, it was with Lithuania, as you remember, that everything began with the restoration of its independence. Therefore, there is always a very serious question. This is not a joke, this is not American intelligence at all, they may simply not understand it. If we join Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia back with their, I would say, experience of statehood in the 20s 40s of the 20th century, and the last decades, the 90s of the 21st century, and now the 20th century, and the current decades, won't this lead them to destroy the next Russia as well? But there is an important point here. As I said, without clearing the population. Now Putin, we see this from the Ukrainian war, understands that in order to have peaceful territories, they need to be cleaned up. Well, that is, in fact, such a special operation is underway now, because in order to separate the left and right banks of the Dnieper, and then clear the population, perhaps, of the right bank by systematic bombing, and shifting the population beyond the borders of Ukraine or the concentration of the Ukrainian population, for example, in the western regions, which actually retain the legitimate Ukrainian government. There may be such plans. Well, is it possible to expel Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians from Latvia to your Estonia? It's possible now. It's easier than after the 40th year. I mean, it may not be an infantry offensive. But imagine if it's bombing, destruction of energy structures in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, water supply. But after all, a large number of people, given that this is the European Union, and there is no need to be a refugee, they will simply leave these territories in the first months of this kind of development of events. These are small amounts of territory in terms of population. And ethnic Russians living in Latvia and Estonia, even though they have EU passports, they can go to Russia as the safest territory for themselves, which is also absolutely suitable for Putin. given the demographic crisis of the Russian Federation and what the Kremlin calls the Deslavianization of Russia. Well, that is, in principle, it is quite possible to imagine such a war. Do you think Putin himself is hinting at this war, given that during this direct line he said that if someone threatens the Kaliningrad region, it could lead to a full-scale conflict? In other words, is he already forming a narrative for justifying a future war, an attack on the Baltic states? Of course, because again, what is the blockade of the Kaliningrad region? They can invent the blockade. Something to demand from this, right? Some new transit, some new conditions, something else to blame for the fact that some conditions of this agreement are not being observed by Rogozin, and then declare that the Kaliningrad region is under blockade. You understand that the blockade of the Kaliningrad region is not necessarily a real blockade. This may be a fictional blockade of the Kaliningrad region in Russia. Naturally. Well, then yes. A special operation to unblock the Kaliningrad region. We have no claims against Lithuania, Poland, Germany, or anyone. We're just unblocking our territory. It so happened that they do not give us the opportunity to communicate normally with the Kaliningrad region, to bring goods there. And this is an important part of the territory of Russia. We are not abandoning, they're even knowing all that will be said and written. Yes, and that's why we are starting to attack the Baltic countries with Iskanders, Ha-101 missiles, daggers. Because we are not allowed to lead there, for example, pins and oil. Of course. Well, why the special operation in the so-called restoration of the territorial integrity of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic? Began with Kiev and Chernigov, do you know? It's the same thing. What does the appearance of Russian troops in the vicinity of the Ukrainian capital have to do with the so-called restoration of the territorial integrity of the Donetsk People's Republic? How is it in general? 4 or 5 regions, which they then appeared when there was a failure with Kiev and Chernihiv region. Well, in fact, that is a narrative that changes along the way. In other words, initially it just proves that initially Putin wanted, in general, the whole of Ukraine, its destruction as a state. I think that was not the case initially. I can tell you how it was originally. He wanted some of the Russian troops to completely seize the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and annex these territories, since there had already been a referendum on joining Russia. It would be given, right away, because they were already like independent states. And the other part of the Russian troops was to take to Kiev. Viktor Yanukovych would have come there together with Viktor Medvedchuk, and they would have allowed a referendum to be held in those areas that Putin considers part of Novorossiya, on the left bank. And most of these territories would have joined Russia after these referendums. Putin also spoke on the night of the 23rd to the 24th of February about the self-determination of the people in Ukraine. What kind of peoples? These are the ones. The people of the Kharkiv region, the people of Donetsk region, some other people there. Here. And the other part of the territory of Ukraine, here is the left bank, that is, the right bank, I'm sorry. It would have remained under the rule of the puppet regime as part of the Union State of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. Whatever it was with the Western authorities, I do not know. If Yanukovych failed to establish control over them, then Putin could offer Poland. Establish control over them with Hungary and Romania, or, for example, simply perceive them as rebellious territory, which he would deal with later. But clearly there might not be some kind of operation against them, because it would be considered that there is no incorporation of them in this R. A member of the state can again wash away its foundations. That was the plan for February 2022 year, 2019 year. In general was the plan, if not 2000, on February 2014. Was generally planned the occupation of the entire territory of Ukraine without the western regions, if you're interested. Here. What changed then? At the time of the Blitzkrieg, it was believed that 70% of Ukrainians, that is, the electorate of Vladimir Zelensky, were pro-Russian electorates, and therefore it could be painlessly distributed between the regions that would enter Russia and the authorities of the puppet state, the Vichy regime, right? And 30% of anti-Russian Ukrainians, this is Poroshenko's electorate, had to be cut out and destroyed according to the lists that were prepared on the eve of February 2022 year. And how these lists, as you know, were used to kill people in the occupied regions of Ukraine. But it turned out to be the wrong approach, as they now admit. Because, as you understand, 70% of the strength of this electorate was not pro-Russian. The people who voted for Zelensky did not vote for capitulation, against capitulation to Russia. Not everyone, let's just say. In other words, there were people who voted for Zelensky, and before that they voted their 4 pro-Russian candidates. But they are not. This is not even the majority of Zelensky's electorate. There are about 25, there are 30% at most for the 2019 year of people who participated in the presidential elections at all. In other words, it turned out that 70% of Ukrainians, which is only 30, are against Russia, as this former commander-in-chief of the Russian ground forces recently admitted. So, indeed, the plan has changed. It became clear that it was impossible to distribute these people between the annexed and occupied territories, and those territories that would remain to the puppet regime, and that in general. It was a question of whether it was better for most of those people to leave the territory of the former Ukraine, as they call it. That's it. This happened because they were convinced that Ukrainians do not support them. Vitaly, in this regard, well, still returning to the threat to Europe, yes. But we see that the NATO Secretary General directly stated recently, in general, he made a keynote speech, who said that Europe needs to prepare for war because it's coming soon, and he said this a little later. Russia may soon become stronger than NATO. And Putin, as we see in this speech, is actually mocking Ryut, saying that let him look at the main member of NATO, the United States, which now no longer considers NATO an enemy, let him look around. It was a direct threat, and at the same time a mockery. In other words, does this mean that Europe should really take such statements very seriously? Or is it still mostly, well, as we said here, a bluff? Rutte says one thing, Putin says another. The United States is out of the game altogether. What's going on? The fact that Putin can take advantage of the window of opportunity that opened up for him at the time of Trump's stay in the Oval Office, to try to at least unleash hybrid guilt against Europe. This is an absolutely correct assessment of the General Secretariat. If we understand that Trump will not defend Europe from Russia, then Putin has the opportunity, at least until the 29th year. To try, by the way, we do not know what will happen in the 29th year. We can hope for the collapse of Trumpism, but it can be a long-term ideology. At least it can extend to 2 or 3 presidential terms. Let's imagine that Trump's heir will be an ultra-right Republican. There are views that were broadcast by J. Devens at the Munich conference. That would mean the United States is still inferior in Europe. The ability to defend yourself on your own. Well, in that case, do you think Europe has heard Mark Rutte? I think yes, just that hearing and taking action are not the same thing. And how do you assess these actions now? I think there are more actions in a number of countries that are closer to Russia than in a number of countries that are further from Russia. And in many ways everything will be decided in the elections that will be held in the coming years in European countries. Do you understand? Who will be the president of France? Because an alliance of Germany, France and Great Britain is needed in this confrontation. And Italy. How will the political situation develop in Poland? This is all a very important question. The last moment. Putin promises not to hold news foes if Russia is treated with respect, as Russia, according to Putin, treated with respect to NATO, which deceived Russia's expectations and expanded to the east. So maybe respect Russia, and then there will be no new wars. And what does it mean to respect Russia? Well, we know that. We read this from Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, when this sick uncle forced himself to respect himself. He could not have invented it better. This will agree with the fact that it is necessary in general to please the old man in every possible way. To return to him all spheres of influence, not to prevent him from restoring the Soviet Union. That's respect, you know. Well, that is. Simply put, it's to give up without a fight. Surrender without a fight or, as Putin says, we will take by military means what you do not want to give the diplomat. Of course, to give up without a fight, like Eugene Onegin. Waiting for something to happen to the old man, and what if he turns out to be the most alive of all the living? We are waiting for a good outcome with the old man. And a good outcome with the old man in our version is just the same when the uncle fell ill and, as it were, went to those wonderful places where his travelers are. Brezhnev, Stalin, Khrushchev, well, in general, there's somewhere. By the way, I do not know in which cemetery they are all buried, but it seems somewhere nearby. No, not side by side. Brezhnev is buried along the Kremlin wall with Stalin, Hershon, Novodevich. These are different cemeteries. And a very good poll of where Putin will end up as a result. That's for sure. I hope as mummy, to watch and remember. So you're in the mausoleum of Lenin to believe, yes, I understand it. Yes, well, it will be very right, because people should see, you know, like in a cunt scammer, these are, excuse me, freaks, well, to know how not to repeat mistakes. You cannot drink during pregnancy and commit other obscenities. Thank you, Vitaly, very much for this conversation, and I hope to hear us in Europe after all, because we need to prepare for war. So that it does not happen. Good luck. Peace and health. See you soon.